Afternoon, everybody. This week is Parshat Vayigash. Thanks for tuning in. For the last 3 weeks, this is already week number 3, that the main character, the main actor in our Torah portion is Joseph. So, why not talk about Joseph? Let's jump in to discuss a little bit about Joseph. 3 weeks ago, we started this whole saga with Joseph and his dreams and his brothers not liking him and then being sent by his father to check on his brothers. Ultimately, his brothers selling him into slavery, him languishing in Egyptian prison for a long time. Finally, he gets elevated, becomes the viceroy of Egypt. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and he's now basically presiding over the superpower of the world, the one where everybody's coming for food because there's a famine that's ravaged the entire region. And Joseph meets up with his brothers already last week, a very dramatic Parsha where Joseph recognizes them, they don't recognize him, and back and forth. Anyway, the showdown comes to a head in the opening of this week's Torah portion, where Joseph, the end of last week's Torah portion, tells the brothers, he basically frames Benjamin, his younger brother, and says that he's going to be a slave to me, and the rest of you go home. And of course, this was an unmanageable situation because Jacob had been hesitant to send Benjamin down to Egypt because he was afraid that he might meet the same fate as his older brother, Joseph, his other full brother. And Judah, who had taken responsibility for Benjamin, can't let this happen. He's got to get his brother out. And so this week's Torah portion opens with that exchange. And then it goes on to talk about how Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And then, of course, they're terrified because here now Joseph has got all the power and he can mete out some retribution, payback. It seems to be payback time for everything they did to him. And yet Joseph takes care of his brothers. He invites his father and their household, everybody come down to Egypt, and he was going to sustain them through the years of the famine. And that, in fact, we read in this week's Torah portion that Joseph keeps repaying their misdeeds with kindness, and he feeds them and he sustains them. So that's basically the story of this week's Torah portion. Now, Joseph is actually, besides being the hero and the main character in these Torah portions, Joseph is a name that the Jewish people are referred to. In fact, Psalm 80, the book of Psalms, we read in verse number 2 that God says, "Give ear," the psalmist says, "Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, who leads Joseph like a flock." Commentaries, Rashi and others explain what leads Joseph like a flock. To lead Joseph, meaning the Jewish people. So the Jewish people are referred to by the name Joseph. We know we're referred to as Israel, as the house of Jacob. We all get our DNA from the patriarchs. Joseph, who wasn't one of the patriarchs, but yet somehow his name is the name of the Jewish people, as evidenced in this verse. And so there's something obviously we can learn from Joseph's behavior. Maybe we'll get back to that at the end of our little time here together. But I want to note that in addition to the Jewish people being referred to as Joseph, God is also referred to as Joseph, or Joseph in this verse of in Psalms, in Psalm 80, is also a reference to God. We find a very interesting midrash. The midrash says that the Jewish people turn to God and say to God that just as Joseph gathered in the time in the years of plenty for the years of famine, so too we ask God to gather us from this life into the world to come. And just as Joseph sustained his brothers, according to their actions, we ask God to sustain us as well according to our actions. And finally, the Midrash says that we ask God that just as Joseph's brothers paid him, they were bad to him, they were mean to him, and Joseph repays them with kindness, so too we ask God to repay our cruelty to God, meaning our misdeeds, our sins, to repay that with kindness, with goodness. This is what the Midrash says. So the Midrash is taking the vantage point that Joseph here is a reference to God. And we're asking God to behave like Joseph behaved with his brothers. Now, the Midrash itself is very, very problematic. Just 2 questions that I'll throw out there, and then we'll try and make sense of it. Number one, in the analogy, we're saying that we ask God that just as Joseph gathered in the years of plenty for the years of famine, so too we ask God to gather us from this life, the life in this world, to the world to come. Now, if you're going to compare these two ideas, so then in the analog, the world to come would be compared to the years of famine, whereas the years in this lifetime, in our life in this world, is compared to the years of plenty. That seems to be opposite of what we're trying to say. That's number one. And number two, in the second request, we ask that God, just as Joseph repaid his brothers according to their actions, and specifically it means that every brother, every one of his siblings got the amount of sustenance that they needed for their families. So we ask God to repay us according to our actions as well. What's the request? God is just and kind, and he's a mensch. He's not a man, not human, but God is certainly works at least according to the letter of the law, at the very least. And so if we do something good that deserves a reward, of course, God pays us for what we're doing. What do we have to ask God? What's the special request for God to repay us according to our actions? That's a given. The second part, when we ask that God repay our sins with kindness, okay, that's already an ask. But what's the request? That God, the basic decency, menschlichkeit, that God and justice, that God should repay us according to our deeds. That should be a given. So those are just two questions. There are many others, but let's just, we have limited time, so let's just try and make sense of this on a deeper level. The idea that our world is compared to the world of plenty, and the world to come is compared to the world of the years of famine, tells us what the Jewish perspective is on our world versus the world to come. Many other religions, the idea is that we live in this world, and the objective is to get to heaven. The objective is to get to paradise, to get to the higher world. Judaism says no. The main action happens in our world. The main purpose for which God created all of the worlds, and the main place where God's will is manifest is in this world. There's no better place to go than the world in the here and now. And yet, so why is that though? The reason is because it's only in this world. What makes our world special, even greater than heaven, paradise, and the world to come, is that it's only in our world that we get to fulfill God's will. Paradise is the reward for fulfilling God's will. That's the pleasure we get since we work in this world, and sometimes we toil and with great sacrifice and effort to fulfill God's will. So it's only right that we should derive some pleasure from the fruits of our labor, from the work that we've done. And so the world to come is a place where we reap the reward, the benefit. We experience the pleasure that is in the performance of mitzvahs, which we often don't experience in our mitzvah observance of serving God in this world. It's not always necessarily pleasurable. So that's the world to come. But of course, where is it that we can fulfill God's will? That's in this world. So where are God's needs being met? That's in our world. And that's why our world is the world of plenty, whereas the world to come is the world of famine, is the year compared to the years of famine. It's in our world where there are plenty of opportunities to satisfy God's will. And it's our world where God receives the pleasure from our efforts in this world. And so that's the request. The Midrash tells us we're asking God that we don't want to take a step down, that we live our lives, we serve God, and then we go to heaven, and all we have is the pleasure that we get from our service. What about the pleasure that God gets? We want to experience even that in the world to come. And so the request is that just as Joseph gathered in the years of plenty for the years of famine, we ask God that he gather the pleasure that he has from our roles in this and our service of God in this world, and allow us to experience the divine pleasure even in the world to come. But of course, this underscores this idea that the primary space, the primary place, the primary stage is our world. There's no better place to go. And ultimately, of course, in the time of the redemption, we come back to this world where we experience all of this in its greatest measure. Moving on to the next request, where we ask God that just as Joseph gave his brothers, attended according to their needs, so too we ask God to repay us according to our efforts. What does that mean? Or according to our actions, more specifically, we're going to translate literally, important. According to our actions, what does that mean? It's very nice when we serve God, and we recognize that when we're serving God, we're fulfilling His will. Granted, because of the challenges in our lives, the distraction, the responsibilities, or whatever, we don't necessarily fully appreciate the pleasure that God has. We're not necessarily fully attuned to it, and therefore we ourselves lack maybe pleasure and enthusiasm, but at least we know that it's present. But then sometimes we serve God, and we do it by rote. We do it sort of mechanically. We do things where we don't, not only are we not experiencing pleasure in ourselves in that service, but we are not even mindful of God's pleasure. We're not even mindful of the fact that God appreciates the things we do, which means we're just going through the motions, doing it mechanically. And so we ask God that even here, even when our service of God in this world, in the 7 years of plenty, in that space, is lacking an awareness of God's pleasure, we're doing mitzvahs and we're doing them sort of mindlessly, and we're doing them sort of empty and devoid of any kind of intention. judge us or repay us according to our actions. Look at the action itself. The fact is that we met God's needs. The fact is we satisfied God's need. Whether I was aware of it when I did it or not, whether I was sensitive to it, conscious of it, experienced it or not, let's leave that aside. We ask God to repay us according to our actions, to our behaviors. That's how we want to be judged on behaviors, not so much on the intention that might have been lacking in the mitzvah that we might have performed sort of mindlessly and lifelessly. So we want, and again, turning that back inside, when we talk about our performance of mitzvahs, we have to recognize that God derives pleasure, that every mitzvah we do is significant, that God finds pleasure in it, even though there are times we'll do mitzvahs and we'll do them without that awareness. We ask that God fill that experience, recognize that all those mitzvahs that we do, to fill them with his pleasure so that we can experience that as well. And finally, the final thing, which is we ask God that just as Joseph repaid his brother's cruelty with kindness, we ask God to do the same with us. You know, it's one thing to ask God to allow us to experience his pleasure even in the world to come. It's another thing to ask God to allow us to experience the pleasure he gets from our mitzvahs when we're not even aware of it or sensitive to it. But then, talking about chutzpah, the idea that we can commit a sin and then ask God to view it, as it were, as a good deed, meaning we want him to repay us as if it was a good, to reward us as if we had done something good, that's already a seemingly chutzpah. But here we recognize something else. What's in the story of Joseph? Joseph tells his brothers, and that's in this week's Torah portion, he says, you had mean intentions, and you did something very cruel. They threw him into a pit, they tried to kill him, then they sold him. So their actions were terrible actions. Not only were they terrible actions, their intentions were terrible intentions. So however you look at it, the brothers' behavior with Joseph was bad, was sinful, was evil. And yet Joseph says, but look beyond, look at the bigger picture. Look at what happened here. What happened was you had bad intentions. You did something wrong, true. And you'd have to atone for that, perhaps. But ultimately, God intended it to be good. Ultimately, something good came out of it, which is that I was put in a position where I can save the whole world, essentially, and guide them through these years of famine. And so when we sometimes fall, when we sometimes not only don't do mitzvahs and don't do them, sort of mindlessly, but actually sin, that creates an opportunity for tshuva, for repentance. It creates an opportunity for us to return to God in a deeper way, to commit to God and connect to God in an even deeper way than before. So true, committing a sin is never okay, it's never justified. But when we take a step back after the fact, and we look at the big picture and we see the opportunity that it presents for us, which is a coming together, a much closer connection with God, that is what we want God to be mindful of as well, and to repay our bad with good. And the same is true for us. We have to recognize, as we started by saying that in this midrash, yes, we're taking the verse out of its context in Psalm 80 and referring to God as Joseph, but in the simple meaning of it, it's the Jewish people that are Joseph, because we have to look and behave in the same way. We have to recognize that when we look at our fellow Jew, we have to recognize that everything they do, they're doing God's work, they're fulfilling God's will, whether they know it or not, whether they intend it or not. And rather than judge the person by their intention, and because we can't read minds, we don't know what's in the heart of man. And even if it's obvious that they're doing something maybe for the wrong reasons, for ulterior motives, to judge them by their actions, by those behaviors. And even when somebody does something wrong, somebody wrongs you, to recognize that it's actually not, rather than to take that personally and to be hurt and offended and start some kind of a fight, but to recognize that it's actually an opportunity for growth. That sometimes when there's friction and conflict within our relationships, that not sometimes, every time, it's an invitation for us to grow deeper and closer in the reconciliation that is now on the table, now something that can come about. And the same is true with regard to ourselves. To recognize that in our relationship with God, to appreciate every time we do a mitzvah that God delights in it and gets ultimate pleasure from it, to recognize that this is where God's pleasure is expressed or experiences in this world greater than the world to come, to recognize that even in our empty actions, ultimately, anytime we do a mitzvah, the true deeper core of ourselves is truly activated in fulfilling God's will. And that ultimately, even when we fall, rather than be discouraged, recognize that it's an opportunity for us to dig deeper, rather than say, I'm not cut out for this, I can't serve God, I'm failing it, I'm not good at it. Rather than say that, to recognize that it's an invitation to dig even deeper, to find our true inner core, our true inner connection with God. And then we behave like Joseph, and we're worthy of being treated as Joseph's flock, God blessing all of us with sustenance, with everything we need, with all the blessings we need. And for us, truly appreciating every interaction, every good deed, and recognizing the true infinite potential that it contains.